Yeah, Methodist Church has identified some years ago that there was a real kind of an absence of pastoral leadership in our pastors. And it took this very seriously because we are probably in some of the most challenging times that we have seen in a really long time. And the church really desperately needs good pastoral leadership. And so they began to develop sort of extracurricular ways of educating clergy and how to be better leaders. And they called it pastoral leadership development. I had to go through 2 classes of that. Each class lasted 9 months, and we had a book to read every month for 9 months. That's a lot of books in a short period of time. And then advanced into peer mentoring, which was the doctoral program of the pastoral leadership development. And it all was designed to do was to help pastors learn how to lead their churches out of kind of where we have been. I would call it the malaise, or the sort of the stagnation of the church, into the 21st century, and to make vital congregations of every congregation. But there's a problem with pastoral leadership. When we're trying to get the churches to do the necessary things that they must do in order to change and to be vital and healthy, it creates problems in the church because not everybody thinks the church ought to change. Some people think the church is just fine the way it is, leave it alone. So when you begin to say we need to change, we've got to do that, it creates oftentimes a backlash. I know personally, I have experienced that backlash. I've been the recipient of critical and sometimes unkind comments. And sometimes those comments are intended to hurt. And I'm here to say it does hurt. It is effective, and I wish it didn't happen. But that's just the state of the church, the way things are today. But whenever I had those periods of sort of being criticized for trying to do what I think is the right thing to do, and I've always tried to do what I think is the right thing to do for the church. I really have the church's best interest. I think, when the church does well, I do well. So I'm always trying to do those things that I think are really important to help the church. But in times of criticism and negativity, Moses became my hero of the faith. The story of Moses really spoke to me, because Moses had to put up with a lot of that for 40 years. You remember the story of the Exodus, probably most of you do, and some of you may not be really familiar with it, but the Hebrew people got down into the land of Egypt out of necessity, in a sense, but Joseph, who was one of 12 sons, was kidnapped. His brothers, out of their jealousy, sold him as a slave. And he ended up in Egypt. And fortunately, he ended up in the royal household in a strange sort of way of circumstances, which I will not get into. But he became kind of a favorite official of the Pharaoh, and the Hebrew people were given permission to move from the land of Canaan down into Egypt. There was a famine going on, and they came down into Egypt, and they stayed about 400 years, and they did well. They became herders of sheep and goats, something that the Egyptians didn't particularly like to do, but they liked the meat, and so there was kind of a niche for them, and they came into Egypt, and they really did pretty well. In fact, they prospered, and they did so well that the Pharaoh and the Egyptian officials became worried about all of these Jews in the land of Egypt, and maybe there'd be so many of them that the Egyptians themselves might become a minority. And so they came up with a 3-pronged plan to deal with the Hebrew problem. The first, they would take away their land, and they would take away their flocks, and they would enslave them. They would all become slaves. Second, they would put so much work on them that it would be almost nearly impossible for any human being to do all the work that was required of them. And if they fell short, they would be whipped, sometimes killed. And then third prong was that every male baby would be put to death. So the Egyptian midwives were instructed by the royal officials that if you are there helping a Hebrew woman bear a child, if she has a daughter, the daughter can live. If it's a boy, then just smash his head against a rock and put him to death immediately. And that was their plan. Well, Moses was one of those babies that was supposed to be put to death. His mother could not foresee that happening, and she came up with a brilliant plan to put him in a basket sealed with pitch, be watertight, and go down to the river where there would be some Egyptian women who would be bathing, washing their clothes, and float him downstream, and hopefully, there's a big chance, might not work, but if it worked, one of the women would hear that baby crying in that basket and would take pity on that child and would rescue him and raise him plan worked brilliantly. What she didn't know was that it was the princess, one of the daughters of Pharaoh, who happened to be bathing that day. And she did take pity on that child. And she raised it as her own, but she needed someone to nurse it. And they looked for someone, any volunteers here who would be willing to nurse this child. And Moses' mother said, I'll do that. And she was allowed to sort of spend time with her own baby, even though it was going to be raised in another home, and to watch it grow for a time. And during that time that she had the opportunity to raise her child, for a while anyway, she would tell that child where you came from, that I am your real mother, and I am a Hebrew person, and the Egyptians despise us, and they hurt us, and they have enslaved us. So Moses, growing up in kind of a schizophrenic world, he was raised in the royal household of Egypt. But his nursemaid was also his real mother, and she taught him about the Hebrew people, and he had sympathy for the Hebrew people. And one day he saw a taskmaster beating almost to death a Hebrew slave, for he wasn't working hard enough or fast enough making mud bricks with straw. And he intervened, and he saved the Hebrew slave's life, but he ended up killing the Egyptian. And from there he went on the run. He ended up somewhere out east of there in the land of Midian, and he fell in love with the daughter of a man named Jethro, and he married her, and he was included into that family, began to raise some flocks of sheep that belonged to his father-in-law. And one day while he was just tending his flock, he saw a burning bush. How odd there would be a burning bush in the middle of nowhere. Who would have set that bush on fire? But even more odd was how come that bush is not completely burned up? It's just like it keeps on burning and burning and burning. So when he drew near to sort of see what this was all about, he heard the voice of God, and he had a divine encounter with God. And God was saying, I want you to lead my people, the Hebrew people, out of Egypt. It's not the promised land. They need to move, and I want you to do it. You're one of them. And so, as we know, by a series of miraculous acts and famines and plagues, and finally the male-born children of Egypt were slain by the angel of death, Pharaoh relents, and the people are allowed to leave. After years of slavery, they're going to their own promised land. But they have to cross the Sinai Peninsula to get there. And the Sinai Peninsula would be the equivalent of the Mojave Desert for our country. Arid, stark, very little water, harsh climate, mountainous, sand endlessly, very little water, very little thing to eat. It's going to be difficult. It's only about 300 miles, though, from the Nile Delta to the Promised Land. Not so far, is it? An experienced hiker on the Appalachian Trail can cover that distance in about 20 days. It took the Jews 40 years. That's a long time to go 300 miles for anybody. But we have to remember that this was a large group of people, and there were people of all ages. You had mothers and infants and small children and teenagers and people in the prime like all of you, and then you had some elderly people that were having a difficult time getting around. And so it's hard to move that many people quickly. And it did. It took a long time. And they had some series of challenges. It would be hard to feed that many people. It would be hard to keep enough water for everybody to slake their thirst. But still, 40 years to go only 300 miles? If God was leading them, then why did God make it take so long? And one of the answers to that question is that God didn't want all of them to get there. In fact, God wanted some of them to die on the journey. The ones who were always complaining, the ones who were always negative, the ones who were always attacking Moses. He didn't want them to get into the Promised Land because they would infect the people with that negativity. And God didn't want that to happen. Remember, God's children are supposed to do God's will. That's why we live in relationship with our God. And when we thwart God's will, we become a hindrance to God and what God wants to do. And when we become a hindrance to God, God is going to withhold his blessings from his people. And some of those people never got to see the promised land. The complaining began quickly. You know, at first when they were told, we're getting ready to leave, we're going to have lamb chops for dinner tonight, and I want you to eat till you can't eat anymore. And then in the morning we're going to plunder the Egyptians. We're going to take everything we can that we can find of use for us, and we're going to leave. And everybody was excited. They were slapping each other on the back and giving high fives to everybody. We're finally leaving Egypt. We're leaving this place. We're leaving this place of misery and slavery and bondage and pain and cruelty. We're going to have our own land. And everybody felt great till they got to the Red Sea. And they looked over their shoulder and they could see a column of dust rising hundreds of feet into the air. And they knew what that meant. That Pharaoh's chariot army was approaching quickly. Someone would be driving that chariot, and there'd be another soldier, and there was an expert archer. And they'd have plenty of arrows. And Pharaoh was angry. All the babies, the male-born children had died. He was seeking revenge, and the people were pinned against the Red Sea, and here comes the army. And people were, oh my gosh, Moses, what have you got us into now? But we know that God parted the sea. The Hebrew people passed through, and then Pharaoh's army followed them, and the waters came over them, swallowed them up, and destroyed Pharaoh's army. People were relieved. Wow, that was amazing, God. And they kept going on their journey. And then they got hungry. Then they got thirsty, and they began to complain. And they complained mercilessly and endlessly, continuously. I want to look at two comments here that the people made. And the first was, oh, how we wish the Lord had just put us to death in Egypt. There we could sit by the pots cooking meat and eat our fill of bread. Isn't that weird? I guess they were saying, I would rather die in Egypt on a full stomach than to be free on an empty stomach. As bad as they were, I'd rather be in Egypt. Here's another one. But the people were very thirsty for water there, and they complained to Moses. Why did you bring us out of Egypt to kill us, our children, our livestock with thirst? You know what they were saying? Things were better in Egypt. Why did we ever leave Egypt? How good was it in Egypt? Let's look at that comment for a minute. Was it really that much better? They had lost their land. They lost their flocks. They'd lost their way of life. They were forced into hard labor under the lash. They were losing all of their male babies. Today we would call that planned genocide. So really, what was so great about Egypt that they would want to go back there again? You've heard that women who are abused by their husbands or their male lovers, verbally, physically, emotionally abused, even when they have an opportunity to leave, they stay in kind of a strange and twisted kind of way. Why did you stay when you could have left? Because at least I have a roof over my head and I have food for myself and my children to eat. And the fear of the unknown is greater than the misery of something that I've grown comfortable with and have adapted myself to. Isn't that sad? I'd rather exist in something that I at least know what's going on and know how to handle it than to be free but have nowhere to go, no roof over my head, no job, no money, out on my own. And so a lot of women just stay in those abusive kinds of situations. You know, we are creatures of habit. We all like things to stay the same. I think a lot of us do anyway. You've heard the old adage, though, if you grew up in a town and you moved away for 40 years and you're going to move back again, don't expect that town to be like it used to be when you lived there, because it's changed. A lot of people that you loved and knew as friends, they're gone. A lot of new people will come. It'll never be the same. You've probably heard that before. In 1987, I took my first trip to Sweetwater Lake on a conference backpacking trip with a group of teenagers, and with my good friend, Dr. Steve House. And I remember going down the Vail Pass. If you're familiar with Colorado, you know where that is, and was shocked, really, by the real estate development that exists as soon as you come down out of the Vail Pass into the Vail Valley. And it begins there with beautiful vacation homes and golf courses and condominiums. But for the next 40 miles, that's all you see. Condominiums, shopping centers, restaurants, homes, in this beautiful valley. I remember what it used to look like in the 1950s. It looked very different then. But you go through Vale and Avon and Gypsum and Eagle and just, I've read recently that on a given day there could be as many as 600,000 people living in the Vale Valley. They all happen to be there at the same time. That's a lot of people. And then you get to the head of the Glenwood Canyon and you turn off at a little spot on the map called Dot Cerro. And you get off Interstate 70 and you drive along the Colorado River for 10 miles on a chip and seal road. And then you turn off of that road, and that landscape, by the way, is stark and arid and a desert kind of country. And then you turn off on a dirt road and it winds up to a higher elevation, eventually coming to Sweetwater Lake. And part of the road, there's a deep gorge on one side. And I remember looking out one day and saw a car that had gone off the road and just was way down in that ditch. Had been there for years and years and years. And then you come to Sweetwater Lake, and it's a beautiful mountain lake, cold water surrounded by beautiful mountains and lush aspen forests and spruce forests. And I loved it. It was great. And then I kept going back. I don't know how many times I've been there, at least a dozen times probably over the course of really 25 years. I went there a couple of years ago. And every time I would go up to that same place, there would be a new house, a new vacation home, or some place that somebody had built and began to change. Almost around every bend in the road, there'd be something that didn't used to be there. And every year there'd be something else added to that. Places I never would have thought somebody would build a house, there was a house. And finally, at Sweetwater Lake, there was this monstrosity of a house. It was a cube on a promontory overlooking this beautiful lake. And I thought, what an eyesore. How could anybody have built such an ugly place in a beautiful spot like that? It was the brother of the woman who ran the dude ranch there. Her name was Adrian. I can remember her name, Adrian, because that was the name of Rocky Balboa's wife. Remember in the Rocky 1, 2, 3, and 4? And you remember how Rocky would call out to Adrian on the skating rink in that thick Bronx accent? Adrian! I always remember her name, Adrian. It was her brother. And she gave him the land to build that house. But it was an eyesore, I thought. Ugly thing to put up in such a beautiful place. You know, what was happening to me was that the present realities of that beautiful valley were clashing with some of my precious memories of what it used to look like before it was really discovered and before so many people started moving there. The Exodus was a time of testing. Would God, who called them out of Egypt, provide for them on their desert journey? They got hungry. They began to complain. They always had food to eat in Egypt, but not now. And then God provided huge flocks of quail to have fresh meat and manna from heaven. Every morning they could go out and gather manna and make unleavened bread. Then they got thirsty, and they complained about not having enough water to drink. And Moses took his staff and he tapped the rock, and a spring of fresh water began to rush out at the base of that rock. And they had plenty of water, and they stayed there for a while at places they called Massa and Meribah. And they filled up their canteens and their water jugs, and they continued on their journey. And God called Moses to be their leader. And you have to remember, it wasn't his idea. He was perfectly content tending that flock of sheep. God said, I want you, Moses, to lead the people out of bondage. And he said, who am I to do that? I get so nervous in front of a crowd of people, I can't even talk normally. I stutter. And God said, I'm going to provide two men, Aaron and Joshua, and they'll be your right-hand men. And they'll help you every step of the way, and you can do it. But Moses took the brunt of the criticism. And it was almost every day. How can you do this? You're not a good leader. You're bad. Things were better. You don't even know where we're going. It's taking forever. Complaint after complaint after complaint. Egypt was not the promised land. It's not where God wanted them to be. It worked for a while, but only for a while. But that's not where God wanted them to be, in that land flowing with milk and honey. He had something better in mind. But the people got comfortable in the wrong place. They got comfortable doing the wrong things. Might have been okay once, but it was no longer okay. And you know what? If Moses had listened to the grumbling, critical, negative, stubborn, and stiff-necked people, if he had listened to them and did what they wanted to do, they would have gone back to Egypt. And they would have lost their freedom. There would be no promised land. There would be no Jewish religion. And there would be no Hebrew people. Let's pray. God, in the midst of change,